Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebeca Omordia, who essentially has been on a residency with us for the last 2 days. So yesterday presented a wonderful lecture cycle to our students from the School of Keyboard, and today has been working with our wonderful PGRs, and now is going to give a presentation. So Rebeca has an extraordinary kind of career over the last few years. Her research initially in piano music involved almost primarily music vibration courses and Delius, Ireland, and some early success in competitions led Rebeca to tour extensively with Julie Lloyd-Webber in this British chamber music repertoire. And indeed her PhD in Romania is also in this repertoire. But then more recently, and especially from about 2019, Rebeca initiated the African Police Concert Series at Newport Hall, and has had huge interest in developing our knowledge kind of further afield in this repertoire. A really rich list of recordings, premieres, and thinking of some close to my heart, Erlen Wallen's Piano Concerto, but many other works as well. And more recently has also been touring and working with Leon Bosch. So based on what I've seen of Rebecca's work so far, I think we're in for a real treat today. So can we welcome Rebeca? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, and thank you. Thank you for coming this evening to my talk on African pianism and the schools of African art music, and also my work with the African Concert Series. Performing African classical music and establishing the African Concert Series came out of my own musical journey of discovery. While I was trained as a Western classical musician, it wasn't until later in my life that I discovered African classical music. This richly diverse genre of music, which can be identified as African traditional music, that is many centuries old music performed on African traditional instruments, and African art music, which is a style that expresses certain features on African traditional music. The resulting now substantial repertoire ranges from solo piano music, instrumental music, chamber music, songs, to orchestral music. And after nearly a decade of unearthing music and piano music, while my first album, Ekele, first focused on piano music by West African composers, I gradually started exploring other regions in Africa, North Africa, East Africa, South Africa, tapping into what turned out to be a richly diverse. I launched the world's first ever African concert series in London with the purpose of creating a platform for African classical music to be performed. The series is now in its 7th season and it's resident at Wigmore Hall. But discovering this repertoire, I had built up a reputation for performing Western classical music, big European piano repertoire, Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, Liszt B minor sonata, concertos by Liszt, Tchaikovsky, with European orchestras, and British repertoire. I am Romanian and I am Nigerian. My father was awarded a scholarship to study in Romania, medicine. That's where he met my mother, and he stayed. And I grew up in Romania under Ceausescu's communist regime, and I was trained at the Romanian Music School. After graduating from the National Conservatoire in Bucharest, I was awarded scholarship to study in England at Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, later at Trinity College of Music, master's postgraduate program. This was later followed by a doctorate in music, in piano performance of John Arlen's music at the National University of Bucharest in Romania. While in Birmingham, I won the Delius Prize, which opened my partnership with cellist Julian Lloyd-Webber, and we went on to performing British music chamber repertoire for quite a few years, and this also opened collaborations with other musicians. I met Leon Bosch, double bassist Leon Bosch, was an alumna of the Royal Northern College of Music, and we've recorded albums of British music for double bass and piano. I've recorded concerto with the BBC Concert Orchestra. But I always wanted to explore my Nigerian heritage. And my paternal grandfather was a traditional musician, and he used to play an oja flute. It's a flute of the Igbo people in the southeastern part of Nigeria. And he used to travel all over Nigeria performing traditional music. And it became natural for me to try to discover, to see if there was any piano music by Nigerian composers. And I discovered a school in West Africa. Of course, the African classical music, it is identified as the traditional music and the African art music. But with this repertoire, African musicians, they explored the places of origin, their way of composition uses traditional melodies and rhythms from the countries and from the regions they come from. Africa has over 3,000 ethnic groups, each with their own music and language and culture. And when writing African art, music composers used inherited melodies and rhythms from their own ethnic groups, which results in Nigerian family connections. My research started in Nigeria. And while researching for the piano music, I discovered the whole school of West African art music, consisting of hundreds of composers that emerged from Nigeria and Ghana. Prominent figures, Ephraim Amo in Ghana, Fela Showande in Nigeria, whose music was mainly based on church music. But they used Yoruba traditional melodies to replace the church hymns. Fela Showande is arguably one of the most known African composers today. He studied in London and then returned to Nigeria, where he started lecturing at the University of Ibadan and also broadcasting. Other composers followed suit, and we see a large composers of young Nigerian musicians emerging. Akin Auba, Kwabenant Ketia from Ghana, Ayoban Kole. And they all went on to found the West African School of Art Music. Composers and ethnomusicologists gathered indigenous material and documented this process through numerous academic articles and books, while many focused on creating the piano repertoire that reflects the richly diverse genre of music. And according to Professor Composer Akin Auba, inventor on the concept of African pianism, the search for an African identity in composition became the purpose to employ techniques that would express certain features of African traditional music. And by creating a new musical genre, the composers used it as a medium to bring African culture to the Western world through a language the Western world understands, which is Western classical music. And so the African art music is a blend of the Western classical music and African traditional music. And among the pioneers of the African pianism style is Ghanaian composer, Professor Kwabenant Ketia, that was one of the most significant musicians to compose and write on African musical aesthetics. He also revolutionized the system of notation by transcribing traditional African rhythms and melodies. In his book, The Music of Africa, he emphasizes that the music of Africa is like its language, ethnic bound. Each society practices its own variant. Also, Nigerian composer Akin Auba, the inventor of the concept of African pianism, he published his PhD thesis, The Music of the Yoruba, Dundun, under the guidance of Kwabenant Ketia. And he directed the research center at the University of Lagos, and he lectured all over the world at universities, including at Cambridge University. And he became preoccupied with the concept of African pianism in the 1960s, while looking for a key that could unlock the doors to an African identity in composition. And according to Professor Auba, one of the surest way of achieving an African identity in composition is to employ African traditional instruments. He goes further by explaining that the piano already displays certain features of African music, and by creating a type of African pianism to blend with African instruments, it should be possible to achieve a successful fusion. The techniques used in the performance of African xylophones, thumb pianos, drum chimes form a good basis for an African pianism style. Euba's research on this topic produced many essays and quite a few experimental piano works. But I would like to bring light on Nigerian composer Ayo Bankole. He's one of the most prolific composers that offer piano. Sadly, his life was cut short at the age of 40 when he was murdered by a half-brother, but he left a vast amount of piano music and songs. He was the first African composer to write a piano sonata. It is recognized he's written 3 sonatas, but there's only piano sonata number 2 that the score has survived after his death. And it's called The Passion in C major, and it depicts, each movement depicts scenes from the crucifixion of Christ. But his style is defined by a personal approach to reinterpreting elements of traditional Yoruba music and their blend with European idioms. His harmonic style generally remains tonal, but is frequently characterized by modality. And Africanisms in the work emerged through the use of Yoruba thematic material. In the first movement of his piano sonata, the first theme, while it's not quoting a Yoruba thematic material, is based on a pentatonic motif that imitates the drum effects of the Yoruba drumming, while his second theme is a melodic setting of the Yoruba hymn, Jesu, Jesu, Mokio, which means Jesus, Jesus, I greet thee. Also, there's a Yoruba theme in the development that quotes another song by the Reverend Canon Ransom Kuti, who was one of the pioneers organists and choir masters in Nigeria, and who also happens to be father to Afrobeats legend Fela Kuti. But one of the most important of, I believe, of Ayo Bankole's piano works is Egun Variations. It's also a hymn-based work, but is inspired by the Yoruba Egun music. In the 70s, Bankole used to train Yoruba choirs, and Egun theme is based on a Yoruba song that his choirs used to perform. Unfortunately, the score was lost after Bankole died, but his son, that is also a composer and a pianist, he managed to reconstruct the piece from a recording. According to his son, Africanisms in the piece can be identified as the use of ostinati of various types, parallel chord progressions, call and response, or elements characteristic to Yoruba music. The use of African drumming effects through repetitive syncopated rhythms, formulas, contribute to exploration of the African pianism style in the piano composition. And I will exemplify this on the piano. Thank you. This was a performance of the theme with selective variations. So it was not a complete performance due to the time that we have. African instruments are a major source of inspiration for the music of African composers due to their role in the African culture. Preserving the culture as means of preserving the culture, and also as a medium, spiritual medium between people and their ancestors. Nigerian composer Christian Onyeji notes that to the Africans, music must be saying something to the listeners, even if it is instrumental music. Drum texts respond to and fulfill this cultural norm in many ensemble music types. Another composer from Nigeria that was born in Ghana to Nigerian parents, from the third generation of composers, composer Fredo Welosoke, or Fredo as his friends call him. Fredo studied with Ghanaian composer Kwabena Nketia and also had close links with Euba, and he traveled all over Africa where he gathered music material that he used in his 24 studies in African rhythms for piano. Each study is inspired by music from a different region in Africa. Composers of the third generation further developed this style, and their works have a stronger African identity. And I will exemplify a very short study by Fredo that is inspired by Mbira music from Uganda. Mbira is also an instrument that is played with the thumb, which is reflected in the way this study is composed. When I first started researching this repertoire, most, if not all, the scores were not published or were out of print. I discovered that most of the Nigerian composers had studied in London. Fela Shawande became fellow of Trinity College of Music. Ayo Bankole and Joshua Uzo-Igwe studied at Guildhall School of Music and Drama. So I started searching through the library catalogs of those universities. And to my astonishment, I was able to find some of their scores. The first work by Fela Shawande, dated 1945, Kamura, 2 Yoruba folk songs for organ, was published by Novello & Co. in London. This is now available at the Royal Birmingham Conservatory's library. Through intense networking, connecting with African musicians online and on social media, I was able to discover hundreds of other living African composers, all of whom sent me their scores. One of the very first composers was Professor Akin Euba himself, the inventor of African pianism, who was still alive at the time, and who was in fact lecturing at Pittsburgh University in America. He sent me his scores of songs and piano music. In the 1970s, Professor Euba directed the Research Center at the University of Lagos, and he established, together with Ayo Bankole, the composer of Egu Variations, Ife Music Editions at the University of Lagos, publishing their own scores. Some of the music by Bankole later been published by Chappell & Co., such as the Nigerian Suite that is still available, though most of his scores, they're not in print anymore, and they're not available. But I was able to reach his son in Nigeria, and he sent me all of Bankole's piano music. African Pianism Studies by Kwabena Nketia. They're available on Amazon, but they offer sophisticated rhythmic training for young musicians to explore the potential of African rhythmic and tonal usages. And they're in the spirit of Bartok's Microcosmos, and they show Nketiah's remarkable ability to write music that's educational in function but still entertaining for listeners. Also, Fredo Nolosoke set up his African music publishers company in St. Louis, printing and distributing his many scores. In 2013, he invited me to perform at his African and Afro-American Music Festival in St. Louis, now known as the Intercultural Music Initiative, where I met other musicians performing this music, and I developed further connections. But as the Western classically trained pianist, my approach to performing African piano repertoire did not come from an academic musicological perspective, but had a purely pianistic approach, and came from my desire to discover diverse sound worlds that could be achieved on the piano and that reflected a variety of African musical traditions and cultures. The conceptual view of African pianism as a creative approach has been explained from different philosophical perspectives by diverse musicologists. Just Google African pianism and you will find hundreds of academic articles on this topic. Adjusting the piano technique to suit a variety of sounds similar to those of the African instruments. Turning the piano into a tuned percussion instrument is truly fascinating. I was very fortunate to work with living composers who guided me and helped me understand the tradition of each of these musics. Zoom lessons where the composers sang the melodies or helped me understand the phrasing, or tapping the rhythms helped me understand the accentuation of the beats. Discussing the context of the music contributed to my imagination and how I created different sound worlds. Music in Africa is a powerful tool for communication. It has storytelling at its base, and it's a medium for sharing the richly diverse cultures. And my perception of the piano as an instrument gradually changed, and I found myself discovering a new sound universe. By 2018, my African repertoire was only made of piano music by West African composers. During that year, I was invited to adjudicate a piano competition in Morocco, which led to a fascinating discovery: music from North Africa. North Africa, though, has a different musical tradition, and its languages and cultures are similar to the societies of the Arab world. As Kwabena Nketiah emphasizes in his book, The Music of Africa. North Africa also developed its own style of African art music, with many composers emerging from Egypt during the late 19th century. The Egyptian art music, with prominent figures such as Gamal Abdel Rahim and Halim El-Dab. But later, Morocco, Algeria, and Sudan embraced this new genre at the beginning of the 21st century, and they further developed the style. They wrote music in a classical idiom while using characteristic melodies and rhythms from their countries of origin. Berber, Arab, and Tuareg musical forms are distinct, yes, they share common elements. The use of certain melodies, such as Arabic maqams, creates a common link between their works. I discovered composer Nabil Ben Abdeljalil from Morocco, who reinvents the nocturne to what the composer calls an Oriental nocturne. Ben Abdeljalil's long engagement with traditional repertoires, including Arabic singing, combined with his training at the Conservatoire of Kiev, produced a cycle of 8 nocturnes. The beautiful melodies embellished with abundant ornamentation inspired by Arabic instruments, the qanun. His nocturne number 4 is based on an Arabic maqam, a Kurd mode, on F sharp with the Saba Kurdi tetrachord, and I will exemplify this. So this is Arabic maqam. while searching North Africa, I also discovered composer from Algeria, Salim Dada, whose music is based on Algerian dances. And he's exploring the Tuareg music played by the Tuareg, the Tindi rhythms played by the Tuareg women. But Africa is a large continent, and gradually each country developed its own style of African art music. So I started exploring other regions. In East Africa, in Ethiopia, the tradition of the krar music has produced two prominent composer pianists, past and present, the Ethiopian non-pianist Demahoy Gebru, and following her footsteps, pianist composer Girma Ifrashiwa, who will perform at the African Concert Series at Whitmore Hall next Saturday with what seems to be a sold-out concert. The krar is one of the most popular Ethiopian traditional instruments. In Amhara society, the krar was used in ancient times for the adoration of the feminine beauty, arousal of the sexual impulse, or praise of carnal love. And Girma Ifrashiwa's Elilta, a cry of joy composed in 2006, while written in a Chopin style, is inspired by the krar music and is based on the Ethiopian traditional 5-note scale called kiknitz, and it's very seducing and full of ornamentation. And I'll only exemplify the rain motif. The Ethiopian Tizita scale explores the 1, 2, 3, 5 of the majors. Based on this is written the whole piece. Gradually built up into a rhapsody that later on explores the Ethio jazz, the Ethiopian jazz, with a groovy theme. You can hear this much more next Saturday at Whitmore Hall with Girma himself. Moving forward, according to Kwabena Nketia in his book, The Music of Africa, the music by South African composers is less clearly grounded in African musical traditions. In the southern part of the African continent, we find that most composers practice the Western style of music introduced by the European settler populations. Many works that are inspired by the South African landscape are European in style. But the new generation of composers, such as Mokale Kwampeng, Gombongani Ndodana Bring, are working on changing that, creating a new style and a new path for South African composition. The piano music of African composers is as wide-ranging as you might imagine, given their geographic and cultural diversity. Its extraordinarily varied textures and colors are unfolding. African art music is a musical language that has its own intonation and diction, and with every new piece performed, I learned a new musical dialect. During my research journey, I also became familiar with music by African American composers. known as the music of the Black diaspora. And I would like to outline the importance and its huge contribution to the African and universal piano repertoire. British critic Robert Marty Walker wrote the following: American religious folk song, often referred to as Negro spiritual, is now recognized as the most significant and lasting of all the influential strains within indigenous American music. The spiritual's melodic lines and harmonies were often derived from age-old folk roots. Many were composed with melodic lines, often cast from pentatonic scales, and almost always danced. It is a fabulously rich musical heritage, and its influence is found even today. Freedom songs, as Bob Marley's Redemption Song, share their musical roots with those of the great spirituals. In Africa, there was great belief in the power of the ancestors. Subsequently, African slaves sought to find the meaning of their circumstances through gestures and movements with each other. Though oral culture was a barrier as a result of the different cultures and languages they represented, their spirits connected with each other via the metaphysical properties of sound which energized them, consciously and unconsciously, and in this regard, they recreated their spiritual selves. And as a result, the Negro spiritual became the base thematic material for the works of African American composers, such as Margaret Bonds and Florence Price, both whom produced very powerful works. But 10-15 years ago, African art music wasn't recognized in the British concert halls. In fact, classical music record labels wanted to market it as world music. But generally, bringing unfamiliar repertoire to concert halls is always a risk. When I first started performing African classical music, I was only allowed by the organizers to perform it as encores or short pieces at the end of huge programs of Western classical music. But at the same time, I believed that the best way to reach a wider audience was by releasing an album. But that was also not possible. The classical record labels I approached were suggesting I release it as world music. But how would the piano sonata by Alban Kole or nocturnes by Nabil Ben Abdel Jalil be considered world music? So in 2013, I formed a partnership with Nigeria High Commission in London to promote Nigerian classical music to a UK audience. And they made further partnerships with Nigerian mayors of various London boroughs, all of whom created opportunities for me to perform this music in London at the African Union's 50th anniversary concert or at various diplomatic functions. I strongly believed that we could reach the UK audience by building a Nigerian audience first. This also created the opportunity to meet other African musicians that performed African classical music. During that same year in 2013, while I was working as duo partners with cellist Julian Lloyd Webber, we were in talks with Universal about putting on a concert of African classical music that would be recorded by Decca and would include myself, Julian, harpist Catherine Finch, and Senegalese kora player Sekou Keita, with whom we had been collaborating. I believed we would reach a wider audience if this music was on record, but sadly Julian's accident during a concert together performing John Arlen's Cello Sonata prevented him from playing and put an end to this project. But I continued my pioneering work and I started including the piano works in my recitals. Gradually, the concert organizers allowed me to perform bigger chunks of works of African composers, either at the end of programs or as a sandwich in the middle. The audience became very receptive to this repertoire. And in 2017, during a tour of Romania performing British music, I was given the opportunity to record a solo album at the Radio Hall in Bucharest, and I decided it's going to be Ekele, my first piano album by African composers. Released in the UK in 2018, Ekele brought great success by the critics, and it opened the doors to launch in the African Concert Series the following year with the purpose of creating a platform for this repertoire. While promoting my Ekele album, South African double bass virtuoso Leon Bosch, an alumni of Royal Northern College of Music, reached out to me and he mentioned he had a project, the South African double bass. So we started working together. Within 8 months, we recorded 2 albums, the South African double bass and the 21st century British double bass, given my experience of performing British music. And in 2019, knowing I had enough repertoire and connections with musicians who perform this music, I launched the African Concert Series at the October Gallery in London, featuring monthly concerts of music by African composers, entirely self-funded. In 2020, during the pandemic, while giving an online concert for many organizations that was raising funds for PPE for hospitals, we reached a target of $10,000 US, and it became clear to me that the online platform had become a great and important tool to reach a wider audience for the African Concert Series. So I contacted my musicians and I launched an online edition of the African Concert Series. The streamed series reached an online engagement of 1 million views. And as a result, in 2021, I was awarded a grant from the Arts Council England to create a series of concerts streamed from October Gallery and the Africa Centre. Following its success in 2022, the series was given a recognition by joining Wigmore Hall's family of partners, and in 2023 became resident at the venue. While the aim of the African Concert Series was to create a platform for African classical music to be performed, I soon discovered that the African Concert Series fosters education across cultures and it brings communities together. Africa is very colorful, quality which I have tried to emphasize in the programs of the series through themed concerts, West African piano music, the South African double bass, African art songs featuring program of songs in African indigenous languages, Yoruba, Igbo, Zulu, to name a few, string quartets by African composers, arabesque piano music from North Africa and the Arab world, and so on, focusing on different regions in Africa. And more than 2/3 of our regular audience were of African heritage and came because of the cultural element featured in our concerts, music from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Morocco. Our partnership with Wigmore Hall resulted in an increased cultural engagement, bringing African classical music to an audience that wouldn't otherwise have had access to it. With each series, I'm developing new programs, and creating programs of African classical music has also given me the chance to experiment with this repertoire. A particularity of African art music is combining Western and African instruments, and some works come with added African traditional instruments as accompaniment, others you can experiment with. And I would like to play 2 recordings, very short snippets from our concerts. The first one is an African art song by Nigerian composer Ayo Bankole, the composer of Egon Variations. We've added percussion accompaniment with West African percussionists. And the second video will be string quartets by a South African composer, where we've added percussion accompaniment in a South African style. The aim of the African Concert Series is also to develop new audiences by encouraging young people to attend more classical concerts. And our educational series, launched in 2021 featuring family concerts, revealed that young people are eager to learn more about African classical music. Our interactive concerts gave children and their parents the opportunity to actively take part in our events, giving them access to high-quality creative and cultural opportunities. The next video is from our family concerts from our series at 40 Hall in Enfield, where the audience joined in singing, and there's also an element from our percussion workshops with children. The aim of the African Concert Series is to break boundaries. And as a result, in 2022, we teamed up with non-classical label, headed by composer Gabriel Prokofiev. And we launched a mini festival, a collaboration between non-classical and the African Concert Series, reaching into the electro-classical music field and creating a fusion between the styles. African works accompanied by field recordings, or African traditional instruments accompanied by electronics. The African Concert Series also worked with non-classical label to co-curate a digital album, Outside the Lines Volume 6, a collection of music connected to African art music traditions, incorporating diverse practices including electronic music, field recordings, traditional instruments, and African classical music. African art music does not only bridge the gap between the two cultures, Western and African, but also unravels the cultural diversity of the African continent, which is reflected in its music. Following in the footsteps of my predecessors, Professor Akine Uba, pianist William Chapmanyaho, I bring my own contribution by recording and performing this music. We create a tradition of how this music must be played. Publishing scores, programming, and promoting the works of African composers will allow future generations easy access to this repertoire. Thank you.
Can I just say on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a wonderful talk. So much lovely playing as well. Really, really enjoyed it. I know people will have lots of questions. I see the first hand up already.
Hello, Rebecca. I'm Shane Ginsburg, the Program Leader for Research Degrees. I'm sorry we didn't meet earlier on. I also wanted to say thank you not just for the talk, but for your wonderful playing. It was lovely to hear. My question is about the extent to which composers from different countries within the continent were aware of each other's work when they were writing. I mean, in Europe, it's so small, composers all knew each other. And I just wondered if you could say something about the seeding, the listening, the inspiration that African composers from different areas were and are to each other.
Thank you for the question. Great question. Music of Africa, also as Kwabena Nketia mentioned, is ethnic bound. But in terms of the schools of the composers, this happened on regions where the culture and the musical tradition is similar. So that's why you have the School of West Africa or the School of North Africa. So in West Africa, composers were aware of each other and they worked together, or they studied in same or similar institutions. For instance, composer from Ghana, Kwabena Nketia, Akine Uba, they were recipients of Rockefeller Foundation scholarships. They studied in the United States. Euba, he wrote his doctoral thesis, his PhD thesis, under the guidance of Kwabena Nketia from Ghana. So in this way, they were connected with each other. In North Africa, also, the tradition of the Egypt Art School of Music influenced composers from other countries, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, also a composer from Sudan, Ali Osman, who worked and studied in Egypt. So it all happens on regions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Can I just ask a slightly cheeky question? It's lovely to see so many non-white composers, but they're nearly all male. And I just wondered to what extent that has been changing in more recent times.
Yes, well, Africa is patriarchal and still is. That's why most, if not all, the composers coming from Africa are male. All female composers from Africa is the fact that they're not necessarily interested in writing music or developing careers in music. You'll find a lot of them as performers or singing in choirs or developing performing careers. But they're not necessarily, there's not a tradition for female musicians to write music. Also, when it comes to performing traditional instruments, at least in West Africa or at least in Nigeria, there's certain instruments that before they're only allowed to be performed by men only. So that's, again, that's something. There's women, they sing, they dance, but they wouldn't, because that's how the culture and that's how tradition is. But gradually, this is changing. Also, there's quite a few female composers, but many from African diaspora.
That's great to hear, thank you. Rebeca.
Yeah, thank you for raising that question, because I also had that question, because I tried to sort of find whether I could see them. And I guess related to that, I'm really interested in the status of the piano in the different regions that you have discussed, and the pathways into becoming a composer, where you make those choices to transfer some of the African traditional instrumental idioms onto the piano, right? So there's obviously some kind of dual training and musical culture and understanding going on. So I'm really interested in that pathway before you get to being that composer.
Yes, well, from the schools of African art music, it all started with writing music in a church, from the church music. So that's why a lot of the composers' music is based on hymns, because they were exposed to Western classical music in church. They learned to play organ. Gradually, they started writing in an African art music style when they decided they changed the melodies of those hymns from Western hymns to Yoruba melodies. That's where Fela Shawande, which is the father of Nigerian art music, he wrote Yoruba sacred melodies for organ. Then the next generation, they experimented with the piano to try to find ways that will express those features of the African traditional music. And they discovered that the piano, at least the West African composers, it was the instrument that had the most similarities with African traditional instruments through its percussive aspect. And they explored it. They wrote quite a lot of experimental music, trying to define this new genre. And I believe, from my experience as a pianist, that the third generation of composers they were the ones that defined, at least in West Africa, they defined the genre. And the music that was written for the piano, it's really original and it has a clear African identity. It was always an experimental work, trying to find ways of transcribing the traditional melodies into the European notation. A lot of all of the West African composers worked very closely with drummers to transcribe those rhythms, and then they transcribed it on the piano. There's Akin Aoba, there's also Christian Onyeji, they're all ethnomusicologists, and it was a whole process of transcribing this music and then using it in European style. It's similar to what Vaughan Williams and Hawes did by transcribing the English folk music. The only difference is that with the African composers, because of the system of notation, because African music is orally transmitted from generations, so it's never been notated, they had to find a system of notation that would be close to the African traditional music. But with each new generation, the style was perfected and became more original.
Michelle.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to have missed the first part. Yeah, absolutely amazing. So enlightening, and it's great to hear your amazing performance as well. Thank you. It's not an area I know a lot about, so I really enjoy learning. My question is kind of a basic and obvious one, but what can a building like ours do to get better at representing more music to more people? Because I think we all want to do this, but our sector is perhaps not moving fast enough. Are there things that we can do to bring African art song music into our buildings that we might be missing, or specialists in this repertoire? Because I think we're all trying, but maybe not doing enough.
Well, I think you've started already doing important work. The Howard Williams Prize, which I attended last night, it's a perfect example of moving forward and creating a platform for music of a different heritage to be performed. And I think this can also be reflected in the programming or introducing a piece. At least you can start with a piece in the program of an undergraduate. Say you can choose from this repertoire. Just the same way as it happens in competitions where there's set works. This can also happen in an education environment. There are set works of learning this repertoire and then performing it. When I was trained in Romania, every year part of our final recital, the program had to include a work by a Romanian composer. And let's say within 4 years of studying at the conservatoire, you would at least have learned 4 important works. Of course, there's also the competition. You have Howard Williams competition, which is for voice, but then, of course, there can be instrumental competitions. Chamber music, there's so much chamber music. At the African Concert Series, now we are putting up orchestral works. On the Wigmore stage, we're fitting everyone in and we're bringing this repertoire to the audience. And there are many ways of making this available and accessible, but I think you're already on the right track.
There's a related challenge as well that I wanted to ask about. We were talking about this earlier, but it's kind of depressing to see like chapel publications that are probably now out of print. But the problem is that when they're gated within, albeit defunct publishers, it's almost impossible to access that. I'm wondering what can be done to make some of this music more widely available.
Yes, this is a work that we are hopefully getting to do through the performance of the African composers' works, because a lot of them, well, they've not been published or they're not available, or when we put a concert, we have to make sure we have the copyright, and it's a challenging process, but it's something that it's happening. With the Chapel & Co. that doesn't exist anymore, Novello & Co., then they've been bought, been rebought, it's very difficult, but I'll give an example. Felasho Wander's work was also Novello & Co. Now it's been taken by Shot Music, and it was quite difficult to hire scores, but we managed to get a license to rearrange his suite, African Suite, that is for string orchestra, is one of the most played works. So it's been played even in the UK quite a few times, even at the proms recently. We arranged it for piano quintet. Yes, it took a while to get a license for that, but it wasn't too pricey. And now we are able to, since we have this license, we're able to put it on a concert. And it's a process, but it's part of this whole pioneering work that we're doing. We're also having other composers trying to have them signed by different publishing companies, so the music is widely available. Of course, there's others that they're selling the scores as PDFs privately, which is not very sustainable, but at least it brings this music out there. It's accessible, it exists, and once someone has it on a record, then it means that composer exists. So it's a process, and hopefully by the next generation all this music will be in everyone's library.
Enik, and then John.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask about a word you didn't mention once, I don't think, colonialism. And I was wondering really, there's so much you could talk about, we could talk about, such as what a piano means in Nigeria, given so many pianos would have come during British colonial rule, for example, and whether that might be problematic sometimes to Nigerian musicians. But putting all those sorts of things to one side, just that sort of move towards sort of a modern or post-colonial Nigerian identity. That's obviously a cultural endeavour as well. People forge new ways of sounding and being Nigerian musicians and people. And I just wondered whether you see any interesting shifts or evolutions or progressions in African pianism or any of the other art music you look at, reflecting that shift after, is it 1960 when British colonial rule ends? Yeah, how did that impact on things?
Well, for the African art composers, they changed the songs to Yoruba songs, and they even changed the way church exists. Many articles that, for their purpose of writing for the piano, creating this African pianism style, is to find a means to bring the African culture to Europe. And the means was the piano as a Western instrument. So using what you have to, and we're moving forward. We inherited certain things. We inherited the piano as a Western instrument, but at the same time we created a completely new musical genre, and we are bringing you our cultures now. Before, Africa was seen as a global village. That's why I had the book of Music of Africa as a lecture, of course, optional lecture for the seminar today, because in that book, Professor Kwabena Nketia from Ghana, he's analyzing every society of Africa. Music was organized as society, was organized as nations, each one's with their own culture. Kings, they had a whole system of ruling. And the music was also written based on this system. And it was closely connected to this way of life. So in a lot of parts of Ibadan, this has remained. And the
Tunde Jegede, who you had in one of the slides there, really famous kora player and composer, he will be quite open to admitting this. Because for him, he's grown up with this Malian royal court tradition of playing an instrument. He really feels it needs to belong within that area. And when he hears people playing the kora on the streets at Piccadilly Gardens or something like that, they're not from that tradition at all. And it really, really bothers him. And it's just a reminder for me.
African traditional music, known as African classical music, comes from families, musical families. In West Africa, we have the griots, that they were historians, they were preserving the culture through the music. They were advisors to kings. So there's a whole tradition that has been passed on from generation to generation. And Tunde Jegede is an incredible composer. He's one of the only composers that was trained in both African traditional music and Western classical music. He also plays the cello. So
he went to the Purcell School.
Yes, exactly. So he's been a part of the series from the beginning, and before we used to have interviews with musicians, and in one of the interviews he was saying that when he was growing up learning the kora and the kora, and it was almost transcendental, but he was able to develop this skill, and he's bringing his knowledge and his music to the series. He will also perform next Saturday, so he will bring musicians from Gambia. So if you happen to be in London, or if you're not, it's a 2-hour train journey, please come.
You're selling it really well. My apologies, Dublin.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. Just a question, because you also have Romanian roots. Would you make a comparison between Romanian folk music and African music, and do you find any similarities? Because from what I've heard, I found several
Great question, thank you. Romania has a very old tradition of classical music, but there are many composers, Romanian composers, they use the folk as a main source of inspiration, and I played a lot of this music, and in fact, when I first started playing the African repertoire, at the time I was playing a lot of concerts in Romania, and I played one of the African pieces, one that has more rhythm. And I, as an encore, and I told the audience, well, this is an African piece. And I had people from the audience coming at the end of the concert saying, but it has the rhythm similar to our music. And I think it's the fact that, you know, the folk element in the music has a direct relation to the human experience, regardless of the country. So that's why people can relate to that. Also, from my experience of being raised by a Romanian mother and Nigerian father, and being raised in both cultures, despite the fact that I grew up in Romania. Now I've become a Nigerian because of the way I reason. But from that music in Romania, as in Nigeria, is also at the center of people's lives, folk music. So it's very similar what African composers did to Romanian composers did in terms of using the folk material in their works. So in a way, for me, it was quite natural navigating between the two cultures.
And rhythm as well.
Yes.
The rhythm, the complexity of the rhythms.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's quite a similar approach.
I'm going to bring us to our final question before we repair to the bar. John.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I particularly appreciated the way that you introduced the instruments that the pieces were based on and the musical materials. That really helped. Thank you. Following on from Dobromir's question, my question is to do with composition teaching and the practice of composition teaching. So you spoke a lot about what African musical materials the composers were using, but you were also saying, you know, this is a bit like Chopin, this is a bit like Bartok, and I could hear these similarities. So have you found in your research that certain Western classical composers were more influential in certain regions? For example, the older generation of composers, were they using these Western classical composers as models, as well as encouraging their students to use local musical materials? And if so, have you found any patterns there? Were certain European composers more popular in certain parts of Africa? Is that something you've come across?
In fact, you know, there's not a pattern, and there's not a particular period of the Western classical music that the African composers used. In fact, quite a lot of the living composers said they did not have a specific era that they used as a Western musical language as a basis for their works. Inspiring himself for the Chopin was very evocative for his choir music that is very seducing. That doesn't necessarily mean, but it might also mean that Chopin's music is very Girmay Frashua, because they want to emphasize that particularity, but not because they just wanted Chopin. So they just, you know, reached out to whatever their main musical intention.
Cheers prerogative. I'm allowing one final question.
I just wanted to say, I'm Ghanaian, so I thought I was well versed in like Ghanaian music and Ghanaian culture, but like coming to this lecture, it's not that I wasn't fully versed, so I really appreciate that, and I've got lectures in music. I just wanted to ask, what is like your most favourite piece of music to perform when it comes to African music? And why?
Well, I love Ufie, Igbo dance by Cristiano Nieji. I've not played it. I didn't play it here today. I played it during our even seminar and our lecture recital, and it's because it's based on the percussion music by percussion ensemble Southeastern Nigeria. It's also because it's Igbo music. My father being Igbo, it has a certain energy in it. My grandfather being a traditional Igbo musician was also something that makes me feel really connected to that music. But at the same time, I love Nabil Ben Abdeljalil's Nocturnes. I love Girma's Delilta. I love Egun Variations. So I've actually brought you today the music that I love the most, some of it. So I love everything.
It's a wonderful, positive place to end. We were talking earlier, you said something which really struck me, that everything you do is also political. There's politics in this, it's really important, but it's clear to us also that this is enriching, rewarding, and hugely impressive. So thank you very much for your fantastic talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you.